Hey everybody, so this is just a quick video to show how you can batch edit a roll of film using Negative Lab Pro. So taking your DSLR or camera scan and inverting it in Lightroom using Negative Lab Pro. So let's go ahead and dive right on in. I'll show you how to import the files in and kind of what my method is for going through a roll and doing just basic edits. Yeah, so let's dive right on in. So first thing, we'll locate our roll in the Finder and go ahead and drag it on into Lightroom. I know this first one was the wrong exposure, so I'm going to go ahead and deselect that one, but then I'll go ahead and import all the files into Lightroom. It's going to cook for a second and import them all in. The next step is to hit Command A on my Mac to select all, go to Photo, and flip them horizontal because I scanned the emulsion side. And I'm also noticing all the images are upside down, so I need to rotate the batch of them. So I'll go ahead and rotate them. Next, I'm going to go to the Develop module up at the top there. Once I get to this screen, I'm going to hit the Sync All button at the bottom, so Auto Sync. Go to Profile and select the Negative Lab V2.3, I believe it is, profile. Hit the dropper tool and white balance off of the film area, so just the blank film area. This will give me a proper white balance. Hit R, and I'm going to crop to just the image since I scanned these as full frame scans. From here, when I take a look at my histogram, it's a little bit dark. So I'm going to go ahead and brighten this up a little bit, add a little bit of exposure until the red, green, blue kind of hits that middle point on the histogram. I'll undo auto sync after it converts all those exposures and brightens them up. Now I'm going to hit Control N to bring up the Negative Lab Pro dialog. Under color model, I typically prefer to use none, but it has a few options of basic, Frontier, Niritsu, and then one for black and white film. My source is a digital camera since I used a digital camera. And for pre-saturation, I usually use 4 instead of the default of 3. My border buffer is 0 since I went ahead and cropped everything, so we're going to hit convert and let it cook. I sped this process up so that we don't have to watch it, and once it's done, it'll bring up the Negative Lab Pro dialog screen. I will mention here that these are very dusty scans. I didn't really spend a whole lot of time on this. This is all just for illustration purposes, so ignore all the dust. At this point, I'll hit apply and go ahead and exit out of this screen, the dialog for Negative Lab Pro, because what I'd like to do at this point, because these are full frame scans, is go ahead and just uncrop them and go back to the full frame look of the scan. So I'll do that by hitting the auto sync and it'll crop all of them exactly the same. Then I'll hit Control N and go back to the Negative Lab Pro dialog screen. So this giving me all my controls here. Under the tone profiles at the top, I tend to prefer the cinematic flat option, but it does give you a number of options, and I highly recommend you go through all of them and kind of see what they do and see what different options you have. But this one's been absolutely my favorite to just get the most out of the film. Now when I go through and make my edits, I tend to go dramatic. So I'll move these sliders all the way back and forth until looking at the image, I get a point that I like. I don't really like just kind of moving things up a little bit. I like moving to the extremes and seeing what I don't like. From here, I'll go ahead and color balance all of the images. And this is really something that I can't really give you a end-all be-all setting for this because it's different, for every shot. The thing I like about the newest update to Negative Lab Pro is it has these little arrows at the bottom that makes it to where I don't have to leave this dialog screen. I can go ahead and scroll through the images and make my adjustments to the images without having to each time hit apply and then reopen the screen when I move to the next image. So, moving on to the images, in this instance here, I've got this image and there's three that follow this one that are all very similar. So what I'm going to go ahead and do is exit out of this screen by selecting apply, and it'll bring me to just the develop screen. And I'm going to select just those three images. So 1, 2, 3, I've selected those three. And at the bottom here, once I've adjusted the one image how I want, I can hit sync settings. And now it's saved that setting to all three photos and they'll all have that same consistent edit. This is one of the extremely powerful tools in Negative Lab Pro. And I'll go through a roll of film, find all those similar shots, and do that. So I'll exit out, select just the 4 images, let's say, that are in a sequence, and I will select them and hit sync settings. So this next example here is a time when there was kind of muddiness in the shadows of this image. It was severely underexposed, and the Negative Lab Pro conversion kind of had these artifacts in the shadow areas, especially when I tried to bump up the exposure. So looking at the full image here, I go ahead and unconvert it, and I'm going to go down to curves here, and what I can do is manually invert this image by dragging up on the left of the curves and dragging down on the right. And as you can already see, the blacks in this image are much smoother. And I mean, it's an underexposed image. There's not a whole lot you're going to get from it, but the blacks are truly black here. Even as I raise this up, they don't really have as many of those artifacts in it. And so this is a powerful tool in those instances when you have a severely underexposed image and you're getting kind of weird artifacts in the shadow areas. So once you've edited all your images, you're ready to export them. I'll put them in a subfolder that has a specific name, and then I'll rename the files themselves to something that I'm able to search later on and find the image. And if it's a final image that I'm ready to put on Instagram or put on my website, or just generally have an edited image that's the final image, I'll go ahead and make a JPEG. If I plan to print, I will export it as a TIFF, and when I select TIFF, I will typically use a 16-bit TIFF so it has more color information. And there's a number of file options, but the JPEG and the TIFF are my two favorites. So one thing I will mention is I can't really give you the end-all be-all method for this. There's so many different variables, whether your film is underexposed, overexposed, or across a 36 exposure roll, you may have such a drastic variance in exposures. So the method that I showed you using the curves layer, that'll work the best when you have really weird underexposed images. And for the rest of them, Negative Lab Pro will do a pretty good job. I do suggest giving your eyes a moment to adjust to the file that you're seeing and make really drastic adjustments. So instead of just bumping up your brightness a little bit, I'll move the brightness all the way up or all the way down, and then kind of bring it back to a point that looks right, because sometimes we don't know what's right until we make drastic adjustments and see what really, really doesn't work. So I encourage you to kind of experiment a bit, see what works for you. And again, there's no end-all, be-all, like this is the setting that this person uses, and so that works for everything. There's no just generic inversion option or editing option. It's going to be very unique to every image. So highly suggest going through and just experimenting as much as you can. All right, thanks everybody for tuning in.